right about now. The Funk Soul Brother, check it out now. The Funk Soul Brother, right about now. Right up now, check it out now. The Funk Soul Brother, right about now. Now.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. Well, I hope you are having a great day. We got some actually really good news today at the Right About Now headquarters in Los Angeles. Right About Now, the book, which is based on this podcast, was voted one of the top 100 indie books of 2024 by Kirkus Reviews magazine. And I just wanted to thank all of you who have shown your support for me this past year, written a review on the Amazon site, bought the book, or just wrote to tell me that they really enjoyed it. If you are interested in ordering it, you can find it on Amazon, and it is also available in some bookstores. If they don't have it in your local bookstore, just ask them to order it. Quite easy to do that, and I would really appreciate that. Trying to get the word out about the book. Anyway, just a nice way to ring in the new year. All right, let's get to today's show. My guest is Douglas Vigliotti, who is the author of the new book, Aristotle for Novelists, 14 Timeless Principles on the Art of Story. Now, you might be wondering, why Aristotle? Well, here's something that I did not know. That for over 2,300 years, writers have been following Aristotle's principles on writing, whether they were even aware of it or not. So you see, my man Ari, I like to call him Ari. I feel like Aristotle's kind of a formal name. My man Ari was an ancient Greek philosopher, and back in the day, he laid out a framework for storytelling that is so fundamental that it really shows up everywhere you look, from the works of Shakespeare all the way to, J.D. Salinger. Aaron Sorkin once said, "You should be evangelical about Aristotle's Poetics. All the rules are there." Now, Douglas is an interesting character. He comes to writing from a very unconventional path. He wasn't the typical bookworm type of kid writing in his diary every day. Instead, he discovered his love of writing much later in life when he first encountered a book by Hunter S. Thompson. And he realized that writing could be something very different than what he'd ever known before. And as I mentioned to him, I had a very similar experience the first time I read Catcher in the Rye by the aforementioned J.D. Salinger. So what do all the great writers know that we could learn? Well, for one, they were down with Aristotle's technique. And in our conversation today, we explore that technique and the ancient principles that show up in his writings. We talk about why every story can be classified as either a tragedy or a comedy, and neither of those terms are what you think they are. We talk about the importance of the three-act structure, why certain TV shows work while others fall flat after season 1, according to Aristotle. We talk about why plot might be actually more important than character, and a load of other really interesting topics. Douglas also shares insights from his podcast called Books for Men, which I highly recommend, and talks to me about why fewer men than ever are reading fiction these days. In that same light, he offers some really great recommendations for readers looking to get back into the habit, or just really good book recommendations in general. I have just started reading one of his recommendations this week, and I'm really enjoying it. So I'm so glad that he talked to me about it. It's called 5 Decembers. So sit back, relax, unless you're driving, then don't relax too much. And let's journey back to ancient Greece and learn something that we need to know about the timeless wisdom of Aristotle. As always, you can reach out to me directly at jonathan@rightaboutnowmedia.com. Douglas Vigliotti, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. So first of all, I always like, to start the show, just finding out like who you are, how you got into writing. You touch writing in so many different facets of your career. Talk to us a little bit about your background.
Okay, here we go. 1,000-foot view, zoom out. I would say I do have a very untraditional, not traditional road to writing, in that I was never the kid who was a bibliophile, reading books in his room, writing in his diary. I was a very outgoing kid. I played hockey my entire youth. It was a very, very big part of my childhood. And I didn't discover writing until much, much later in life. And I want to say it was the thing that corrected my path.
What do you mean?
So I loved playing hockey, and I loved the journey I went on from a business standpoint, following high school and into college and, my professional career, sales. And I was able, I did well in the career, and I don't actively remember choosing it. I remember just being on this path that was in some ways chosen for me based on the circumstance of my life. And when I look back on my life in childhood, I do see now specific things where possibly guided in a different direction, it could have went in a different way much earlier on. And so now, having this creative career, so to speak, it feels very much like me. And I actively found it and chose it. And that's sort of what I mean by it.
Yeah. And how did you stumble upon it? Because you were doing other things.
It all started with reading, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm sometimes I hate to admit this, but I will, because I feel like in some ways it's cliche. Like, a lot of people have said this before. Maybe they haven't. Maybe it's just my own neuroses. And that is, when I first read Hunter S. Thompson, I didn't realize that writing could be like that. And so when I realized, oh, this is writing too, that's when it clicked in my head, like, oh, I can maybe do this thing. Like, I can maybe write. And so then I started to explore writing. But that is kind of an oversimplified version, but there's definitely a kernel of truth in there.
Yeah. I had the same experience with Catcher in the Rye, where I was, I guess in school you have to read a lot of books that are, the classics, but they don't necessarily excite you in a way. And then I read Catcher in the Rye, which was written in such a different voice than anything I'd ever read before. And I was like, oh, this is like, I want to do this. This sounds fun, like to write in this voice. And you obviously had the same experience with Hunter Thompson. So yeah, I get it. And I think that's why just keep reading, right? Until you find that voice. Like, I don't think my son, who may or may not be listening to this episode, has really found that person yet. And that's why I think he hasn't really taken to reading as much as
the funny thing about that is it changes so much if you stick with it, right? Like, your model of when you first start, at least in my experience, and listening to other writers and talking to other writers about this, their model changes quite a bit, and you see your writing change quite a bit. And some of that is circumstance, some of that is economic, financial reasons, some of that is actual taste, probably a blend of everything. But it definitely, you need, in my opinion, that launching point. Like, it's a launch pad of, okay, I see myself in this. I think more times than not, people are afraid to admit that they see themselves in the art that they like, and that's why they are pulled to it. Because if they say that, then it's like, oh, you're putting yourself on a pedestal, or you're exposing yourself in a certain way. But to me, it's just normal that we are drawn to the people that we feel a connection with, even if their lives are completely different. It might be an ideology, it might be the way they approach something, could be a lot of different things, but it's that kernel of relatability that I think is really essential. And you could tell a lot about a person by what they like and who they like and what they listen to and all of that.
We will be right back. Right About Now is brought to you by AG1. this is a product I not only promote on my podcast, but when I use, it's like daily self-care for me, because I know that if I put it in my smoothie, I'm doing at least one good thing for my body that day. It's giving me lots of vitamins and minerals that I know I need. And AG1 contains prebiotics, probiotics, and gut-supporting ingredients, which really help support my digestion, and that keeps me regular. I'm going to be honest with you. So I really recommend AG1. You will notice a big difference yourself. And I've got a special offer for you. Try AG1 and get a free bottle of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is go to drinkag1.com/writeaboutnow. That's a $48 value for free if you go to drinkag1.com/writeaboutnow. Check it out now. All right, so from going from somebody who wasn't that interested in reading to somebody who's certainly very interested in reading, then you found Aristotle, who is kind of like he's the the ultimate philosopher and deep thinker. And how did you stumble upon discovering Aristotle in your journeys?
Right. So
it's a big leap from not really reading to reading Aristotle, is I guess what I'm saying.
Sure. Yeah. I will clarify that I read probably in the 1% of humans at this point in my life.
Now you've changed. Now you've changed.
I read a tremendous amount
I know.
in a wide spectrum of literature.
I'm sure.
But it's more or less Aristotle found me. And what I mean by that is when I wanted to start writing fiction and start writing novels, there's two elements to that, right? As most writers know, there's the writing and then there's the story. And story for me was the thing that eluded me. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how to do it. How do I tell this story? And so then what I did is I started to explore screenwriters and people who I admire in the film industry and people who have written about it extremely well. People like David Mamet or Aaron Sorkin or even some of the teachers like a Robert McKee or someone of that nature. And what I quickly realized was that all of this stuff that they were talking about, and quite literally, they were referencing Aristotle's Poetics. And so me, with my newfound reading passion, decided to double down.
Yeah, go to the core of it. Like, where is this all coming from?
Exactly.
Who's the originator? Yeah.
So I doubled down on Poetics, read multiple translations over and over again. And, that was how I learned how to tell stories. And this book really came about not because I read the material to write the book. It's that over the years, it didn't exist. Like dramatic writers have utilized these principles forever to tell their stories for the screen and the stage. But novelists didn't have something formulated for them. And that kind of it was an itch. And then I just needed to scratch it eventually. And so I wrote the book, and I'm excited to share this information in this way with novelists because I think it has the potential to help a lot of people, and because it helped me. It's literally the way that I learned how to understand story.
Yeah. So important. I was just giving a talk about my book last night, and people were asking me, what book do you recommend, for writers just looking to start writing a novel? And this can be one now, because I think that, there's books on writing, like On Writing by Stephen King is a great book, or Bird by Bird about, but it's not really about story, and it's not really about the fundamentals of writing and what makes a great story. And yeah, if you're all these people are basically just riffing off of Aristotle, who I guess was the original thinker on this topic. So might as well just go to the first here. And there was probably somebody before Aristotle. We just don't have the
the
written text, right?
Right.
But maybe let's talk a little bit about who Aristotle was. Give a little history lesson here, because everybody knows the name Aristotle, but people might not be really aware of who he was. And if you could just give us a little
So I mean, he was a Greek philosopher who was alive 2,300 years ago. He was for all intents and purposes, a polymath. So yes, we're talking about story, but he's written work on politics, economics, and in many regards, he is some of the foundational material for a lot of these subspecialties. One of the unique things about him is that he studied under Plato, and Plato studied under Socrates before him. All of these are big names that we hear thrown around a lot.
Right.
But what you realize when you dig into something like Aristotle's Poetics, let's say, or any of his work, you realize why Aristotle is Aristotle. And I know that this sounds kind of canned, but he was really ahead of his time when it came to a lot of this stuff. We only have 31 of his, or approximately 31 of his works. He wrote over 200, but many of them were lost to time. And all of these were never designed for public consumption. They were mostly just notes on his thinking. And we're lucky to have something like, say, a Poetics today, because, we very easily might not have. Now, does that mean someone else might not have identified a lot of these principles and a lot of these theories? Maybe they would have. But there is something to be said that this has stood the test of time for over 2,300 years. And you still hear people like Aaron Sorkin, David Mamet, these people say, you want to learn how to tell a plot? Go read Poetics. They still say it to this day. And just for people who are unclear, Poetics is Aristotle speaking on the nature of tragedies. He was going to speak on the nature of comedies, or he did write about the nature of comedies as well. But that part 2 was one of those lost works that I had just mentioned moments ago.
Can you imagine if somebody would find the comedy? I mean, that would change the face of history.
It sounds like a good start
to a book. I found it. And we've gotten it wrong all these years. We've gotten it completely wrong.
Something like the Da Vinci Code or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm ready to do it. Okay, so you are a novelist, you're thinking about writing novels. What would Aristotle say even before you put pen to paper here? Like what is something that you need to understand fundamentally about story?
Yeah, so this is really, really important. He would say that all stories have 3 core elements. Now, he didn't say this directly, but it ties into tragedy, it ties into comedy, it ties into everything that we're going to talk about here. And those 3 elements are, you have a protagonist. That protagonist wants something, and there are obstacles standing in that protagonist's way. And those obstacles now come in form of external opposition, antagonistic forces, bad guys, weather, parents, friends, you name it. But then there's the more important piece of the internal obstacles, the flaws of that main character, of that protagonist. And every story, including, by the way, the story of Jonathan Small and Doug Vigliotti, rests on the idea that there is a protagonist who wants something and has obstacles standing in their way. This is the foundation for story. And this ties into what Aristotle reminds us in Poetics, that story is an imitation of life. He calls it mimesis in Poetics, saying that that's how we learn how to live as kids, because we mirror life around us. And that's one of the reasons why story is so intrinsically linked to life. It's not just on the page. There is everything that we talk about in Poetics or in this book, and why it's philosophy is because it involves life as much as it involves the stories on the page. And since we're imitating life, this is why we see it on the page or on the screen in the way that we do. The other thing that he said about story, not just with imitation, is the second reason why we are drawn to it is rhythm. So most writers would recognize that as voice, pacing, tone. The meter is what he would call it. And this is why I think you don't need to know grammar to write. You can look at musicians, like, I don't know, I think I write about this in the book with Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel. Neither of them could read music, but things worked out pretty good for them, right? And this happens a lot with writers. You don't need to understand grammar because what you have is rhythm. What you have is voice. And so these two elements are the reason why stories resonate with humans and why we started telling stories at the beginning, per Aristotle. But harken back to what I said to start. Protagonist who wants something with obstacles in their way. If they overcome those obstacles, then we have, and they end up better off, then we have a comedy. If they succumb to those obstacles and end up worse off, we have a tragedy. The far majority of stories are comedic, not tragic. The reason why we like tragic, and it still works, is because it unveils a bigger truth about life. And that's why it's okay. That if we look at classic stories like The Road, let's say, by Cormac McCarthy, a lot of people have read The Road, so this is an easy one to reference. In that story, the protagonist is the father. And what happens to the father is we know he ends up worse off because he doesn't make it. But the reason why we're okay with it is because we know all humans die, and the boy and every boy has to go brave the world without his father. And so just because they ends up worse off, we're okay with it. And then a comedic story, we enjoy it for obvious reasons. That's the Hollywood ending. That's why so many stories.
It's a fairy tale ending. Yeah. But it's funny that they call them comedy. He calls it comedy, but we would call it, because you can have a thriller with a happy ending, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. 100%. It's just the comedic and tragic is more in reference to the shape of your story or the journey of your protagonist than than humor or sad. Traditionally speaking, tragedies are told of people of higher type who have the ability to fall. So in Poetics, he talks about Oedipus, I think his name is, or Odysseus or something. He's the king, and there's a plague in the town, and that's Thebes, or I'm pronouncing these wrong, of course. But he sets out to find what the cause is of this plague. And by the end of the story, he learns that he's the cause. So he ends up worse off, but we learn the truth. And so it's a tragedy, but it's satisfying to the reader. And so these traditionally are of characters of higher type. So kings, noble people, people who can fall.
Shakespeare did this a lot. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. And then comedies are traditionally of lower type. So, middle class, low class
Seinfeld.
People who can, exactly, who can rise. But the thing is we see it all the time in a relative sense now.
Yeah.
Right. So like a comedic story could be of higher type people. They're just relatively lower on the pecking order than the people around them. Right? Like I'm watching The Penguin right now on HBO.
It's funny that you just mentioned that because I was thinking of The Penguin because I just finished watching it last night and I was trying to think, it definitely is in the tragedy because of the way I don't want to spoil the end. But,
I haven't seen the ending yet, but but based on his story, I would have to imagine that it's a comedic story. Now, maybe it isn't. I don't know. I'm going to find out as it arcs here. But I would imagine it would be, because if he ends up better off at the end, getting the thing that he wants, even though a lot of bad things happen, then it's a comedic story. It doesn't matter that he's a bad guy or he's an anti-hero and that he kills people. In fact, we see that all the time relativity is a huge component of modern storytelling, right? The anti-hero wouldn't work without relativity. Relativity being, if your anti-hero kills people and does all these bad things, you have to make the things going on around him significantly worse, a tad later. This is a Robert McKee theory. So, I mentioned him earlier, and he says the audience will always seek the center of good, meaning if everything is dark, they're going to go to the lightest thing in a dark tale. So as long as if you're writing super dark stories, then as long as your anti-hero, your hero is just a tad lighter, you're probably okay.
Or sometimes there seems to be a character in there that's kind of like the voice of reason, or the kind of the person, I remember in Mad Men, I used to think about this, like that was it was kind of a little bit of a, you had an anti-hero there, and then you had Peggy, who was sort of like the ingenue, she was the young kind of, she saw the world in a very much more positive way. Now she ends up kind of getting corrupted at the end too. So the audience kind of goes along with that journey with her. But I think it's interesting that sometimes people use that device where they'll have a character in a dark comedy that's seeing it kind of from a kind of more pure perspective, so that you can sort of like, it's not all dark. Like there's one character, and then Penguin, for example, the kid, right? I don't remember his name.
Yeah, Victor. I'm watching it right now. So
it's like Victor is the character who you can identify with, because he seems like a normal. Now he's obviously going to the dark side with the Penguin, but he comes in as sort of a pure, so I think it's an interesting device that writers use. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but you have that one character in there that kind of is the light in a dark story.
No, yeah, it makes sense to me. I think that one thing of note is, for me anyway, it's much easier. The easiest thing for me to spot storytelling principles because of the form is are movies. Movies, everything is condensed. It's dramatic. It's drama. It's dramatized. Like same thing like a play would be, except obviously it's more extrapolated and there's more things going on. It's a film. But with TV series, it's almost more like an epic, and it's everything is drawn out a little bit more. And in that way, it's similar to a novel, because the novel also can be extraneous in ways that, say, a movie can't be, which is one of the things that you often hear people say all the time is, oh, the movie ruined the novel. Well, it's inevitable, because when the movie gets made of the novel, the movie is, if it's done well, it's the leanest, most potent version of the story. It doesn't have time to extrapolate to be extraneous and go off different, off the beaten path. And by the way, neither do not good novels either, but there is a little bit more leeway. The only reason why I bring this up is to say, like, if you want to really see these story principles, the best are plays and movies. And then once you know that they exist and how they exist, it's much easier to see them in TV shows or in novels. And that's actually, how I learned, was by watching movies and and movies mostly, and then seeing all these. And The Catcher in the Rye is a great example. Like, The Catcher in the Rye is a character study, but it's plot. You like, there is a definitive plot. And, Holden goes on a definitive arc. He wants to be alone. He wants to escape. That's act one. You're learning about him. Then he sets out into the world, into New York City, and he has to battle to be alone and to escape and be on his own. He has to battle the cold world and everything New York City has to offer. And he's battling his own internal flaws, which are he's a liar, and he's got trauma in his life, and he's got depression, and he's lonely. And these are all things that he's battling to be alone and escape. And does Holden ask for help by the end of the novel? Does he return home, or does he get to be alone? And does he overcome his flaws? Does he overcome his obstacles, or succumb to them? Right? Like, this shape still exists in a character study like The Catcher in the Rye. Not to pull back to what just something we were talking about before.
One thing I want to linger on that you had said really early on was that, okay, there's the obstacles that the protagonist faces, that the sort of outward external obstacles. And I think a lot of writers, think of those obstacles first, right? Like, oh, there's an antagonist that doesn't want this person to do it, or, all the different things that get in the character's way. But what they don't necessarily dig deep enough into, and I think this kind of separates stories that really work from stories that maybe don't work as well, is the internal obstacles, that a character starts one way, but he can't, or he or she can't get to where they want to be because there are some, we used to call, I don't even know if tragic flaw is
yes.
Is that from Aristotle, or is that from Shakespeare? I don't know, but I know the tragic flaw. I remember being taught in high school, but the idea that you have, right?
That's the defining characteristic of a Greek tragedy. Is if it's called a fatal flaw. It's called a fatal flaw for a reason, because your flaw becomes fatal. It's the thing that makes you end up worse off. So what started out as love turned to obsession, or what started out as passion turns to obsession. And we see this, a lot, but you're hitting on something that's super, super important and critical. And that is, you're absolutely right, in my opinion, that the internal part of the story is the more interesting, and it's the thing that makes the story the actual story. Aristotle is very insistent about this too. The plot, to be an Aristotelian plot, you have two elements, and one of them is a change in fortune for your protagonist. So either it goes from good to bad or bad to good. And the second piece is a connected series of sequence of events, self-contained connected series of a sequence of events. But the thing is that part one, so the change in your protagonist, has to come from the connected series of a sequence of events. So one has to be an effect of two. And that's what makes an Aristotelian plot. But in order to do that, your character has to overcome their flaw. Without the flaw, without the imperfections, the story is lifeless. It doesn't work, right? It's literally a story that doesn't work. I mean, you need the internal piece. If the character doesn't get stronger, like move away from their flaw, then likely it's a tragedy, because that is when a character digs down in a movie and they're at their lowest point, what do they always do? They always do the thing that they've been battling the entire time. The reason why they do that is because it's a sign of strength. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to always be that way for the remainder of the series and whatever you're writing. It just means temporarily, because that's how they're able to overcome that obstacle. We see this all the time in series and sequels. The character comes back and they still have the same problems. They're still the drunk. They're still but they overcame it in season one. Will they overcome it in season two?
Well, it's an interesting point that you made about how TV is, because TV doesn't have a, sometimes TV shows, they don't even know when they're going to end. Nowadays, I guess TV shows are written like, Penguin is an eight episode arc, so it actually does go somewhere. But like a lot of TV shows, they could be going for endless amounts of seasons, right? So they can't quite resolve some of these character conflicts, right? Otherwise,
I'm going to really shoot myself in the foot here and say that on average, and I know this is not a popular opinion, after season one, most TV shows aren't good.
Yeah.
Well, it's because it's so hard, right, to write.
Right.
It's so hard to write the second and third season if it wasn't designed from the get-go. Because in my opinion, what I observe is TV shows that betray themselves in the first, they betray the first season. They to write that second or third season. And it doesn't mean that, it's just a rarity. It's a rarity. A couple of shows that I've liked that have gotten better are Succession. I think got a lot better in the later seasons. I think the show The Deuce, which didn't get a lot of play.
I remember The Deuce. Yeah, it was great.
Great show that I thought got better in second and third season. I was going to say the same thing about The Bear, but then in the third season, I just wasn't crazy about some of the decisions.
I kind of lost interest in The Bear, to be honest with you. There's something, I just got tired of the characters. And maybe it's because we had kind of understood what their flaws were. And I was kind of like, okay, are we moving ahead here?
Well, yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like Breaking Bad. I don't know. There's certain shows that I love. I mean, the sort of brilliance of a show like The Wire was that it had different characters every season. So then you'd have, you'd follow different stories, but it always resolve within its.
I love all of those shows that you're talking about. The problem is they don't make TV shows like that anymore.
No, they don't. Now they
don't make The Wire. They don't make The Sopranos. They don't make Mad Men. They don't make
sad, the golden era of it.
They don't make these shows.
I don't know why everybody loved them so much, but
this gets at a whole nother.
No, this is a whole other topic. Well, let's get back to Aristotle. Our boy Aristotle wouldn't have been talking. It's funny though, like
he would have been bragging on it. Actually,
he's just talking probably about the tragedies that and the comedies that were being performed in Athens at the time. But anyway,
Well, he actually talks quite a bit about in the back half of Poetics about what fair criticism is of a story.
Right.
And, he's quite clear that there's 5 things that you can criticize a story for.
Oh, let's do it. What are they? Because I love criticizing stories.
It's impossibility.
Uh-huh.
Irrationality.
Okay.
Contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
Harmfulness, and artistic standards. Now, before I talk about the first 3, or we chat about the first 3, I want to clarify harmfulness. He's not talking about if the story is harmful to people. He's talking about if you are writing a story and the depravity or the brutality that you depict in the show or the movie or the book isn't necessary to the plot, to the story that you're telling, it's fair criticism. It is harmful to the actual story. That is that's an important nuance. Impossibility, irrationality, contradiction, all actually relate to principles in this book because they violate principles. Novels should be believable. Novels should be logical. Novels should be cohesive. Impossibility, irrationality, contradiction all violate these principles that I talk about earlier in the book. But I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think those are fair? Do you think those are fair ways to criticize a story?
I guess novels are irrational. I mean, you think of something like, when you're building a fantasy world, it still has to follow the rationality of the way of human nature. I feel like sometimes when you create worlds and they're not even humans within those worlds, the characters still have to act within a rational framework that makes sense to humans, right?
Yeah. So Aristotle is specific with this. He says a solution to a plot problem has to come from the story itself. So whatever we've depicted in the story previously, we have to solve the problems in our story utilizing what we've created. He urges writers to avoid deus ex machina, which is when something comes from outside of your story to unlikely solve a plot problem.
Yeah, that's the worst. That makes people crazy.
Exactly. Yeah. It affects believability of the story, right? Like immediately you say, oh, I don't buy this anymore. I'm not buying what this writer is selling me. I'm not buying what this story is.
I think of Lost. I think of a show like Lost, or shows that couldn't figure out how to end. And then they kind of had to like almost impose an outside solution to solve that internal. And maybe part of it was that it wasn't part of the internal part of the story. That's why it didn't quite work. I loved Lost. That was a show that had a fantastic first season and never quite lived up. Right.
It happens a lot though. I actually find it more in novels than I do in movies and TV shows, to be honest, because most novels, they rely solely on chain of causality, which is a really, really important aspect. That's what makes something logical, right? Like cause and effect. Like this happens, then that happens, then that happens because of that. It's like when I tell a story to Jonathan, I say, Doug walked in the room. You expect me to tell you what happened in the room.
That. Yeah.
Yeah. What happened in the room? You don't expect me to tell you what's happening in the parking lot. What's going on in the room. But, so that cause and effect is a really, really important thing. And a lot of fiction writers, they write what's called pantsing. And so, the plotting and pantsing is this term that's thrown around in the fiction world pretty frequently. And pantsing is just, you're writing to figure stuff out. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I find that it's much harder to write a cohesive story when you don't have the end in mind.
Yeah, know what's coming. Yeah.
And that's where you could really learn a lot from TV movies, even bad ones, because there is that definitive arc and everything is tied together via 3-act structure mostly. And, you could the cohesiveness is a lot different. A lot of novels, and I know I'm betraying a lot of my novelist friends here, rely on trickery, which I think it works as a one-time device, but it's not as satisfying for the life of the book, right? Like you could read it once, but you could read The Catcher in the Rye over and over.
Yes, and it always means something
again.
different to you every time you read it, because you read it at different times in your life. Like the first time I read it, I was a 16 or 17-year-old kid, and I read it recently. I had COVID, and I was like banned to my back house, and I there was a copy in the back house, and I just started reading it, and like, it's such a small book and short book. I just read it cover to cover, and I was like, this means something completely different to me as an adult. As a adult, like I read it completely differently. So yeah.
Now, if you read something that has trickery in it, where you're it's usually when the author is hiding something from you that you should be able to know from the outset, but they're just disguising it in a way that it's not about the releasing of information. There's a subtlety with this. The best example of this that I could say, which by the way is a very cohesive and fun novel, is Gone Girl. But once you know what Amazing Amy is up to, it's not the same when you go to read it again the second time. And so it's not the cohesion that affects that. It's the trickery that affects that. Now, by the way, this was an extremely successful commercially,
but you're right. It's not a book that's going to be read over and over again, because it's like a high concept type book. It has a great kind of twist, right? Which is great. But once you know the twist, it's sort of not as fun to read it, I guess, the second time.
And that's why I always say it's not the trickery. I mean, it's not the cohesion, it's the trickery. And there's a lot of literary techniques that rest on cohesion. Chekhov's gun is one that everyone's familiar with. If you show me the gun in the first act, it has to go off by the third act, right? Or a MacGuffin or a red herring. These aren't trickery, because by the end of the novel, we know why the red herring was important. We know why the MacGuffin was important. They're not just purely like tricking me to go in one direction, and then I'm never understanding the meaning of that moving forward. If you answer the question by the end of the novel, there's cohesion. If you're just, I think that's a good, I've heard Ken Follett say on a podcast, every novel.
Maybe it was mine. He came on mine. That was like one of the biggest thrills of my life to have Ken.
Oh, really? That's amazing.
Yeah, that was pretty amazing. Yeah.
Did he say this? Because
I don't know. Tell me, because he was hard to. Tell me what he said, because I tried to get anything I could out of him. Right.
So I heard him once say that every novel, which makes sense, proposes a big question, and by the end of that novel, even if that question is answered, there is another question that is left open and hanging. And I loved that idea.
Yeah. I think he said that about chapters too, that every chapter ended with a question, or kind of like you had to keep reading. That was one trick he used. Yeah. I don't know if
that makes a lot of sense to me, because when I've read a lot of David Mamet, who I mentioned earlier, and he always says about drama, the only thing that a playwright, like an only responsibility for a playwright, is make it so the only thing the audience cares about is what happens next. So you have to write with the idea that you have to design something that people want to keep finding out what happens next. What happens next? That's the only rule, he says, of drama. And it's impossible to teach to people, because you need to be able to write plays or to write stories to be able to figure out if the audience is going to snooze, or they're not going to have that buy-in. But it jives really well with that question, because that question theory that you said with Ken Follett, because it's really the same thing. It's like, does that author want to move to the next chapter, or do they want to close the book and put it on their shelf and find the next one?
Right. You say that there are Aristotle says there's three big questions a writer must answer to write their story. You might have talked about these already, but can we distill them into what are the three questions that a writer must answer to write their story?
We actually didn't talk about them.
Okay.
Yeah, and please don't confuse me with Aristotle.
Why not? You're channeling him.
I'll do my best, but I'm far from Aristotle. So 3 big questions. So Aristotle says every writer needs to handle these 3 things, and it's medium, object, and mode. So I took them and translated them for the novelist without losing their meaning of what he's saying for in the book. And that essentially is, medium would be the style and structure for the story. So you have to understand what style you're going to tell this story in, and what's the external structure that you're going to outlay your story, right? So how are you is it going to be in 13 chapters? Is it going to be, are you going to be alternating? What's the framework? You need to understand that.
And
Object
is the style, because I mean, one of the things when I took a novel writing class, one of the things we had to say is we did have to define the genre that we were going to be writing in, and that's a little bit more of a modern problem, because, book publishers, they market books through genre. So if you, and it also helps you, so you can't there are some hybrids, but you sort of like, if you're going to be writing a mystery, then is it a thriller? Like, it can't be a mystery thriller. I mean, sometimes they are, but whatever. The main point being, you have to figure out what your genre is, because each genre has different rules, right? Is that
correct?
Kind of
yeah. And I think I think going back, so we'll put a pin into what I was just saying, because I want to come back to it. But that, I think, hinges more on what I would consider artistic standards, because so if we go back to criticism, that fifth criticism was artistic standards, and you could write the story however you want to write it. In fact, I'm a huge proponent of that, right? Like, I like weird, I like unique, I like risky, I like odd, I like all that stuff. Unorthodox, give me it. I want to read that, But you should realize that you're open to criticism if you are going that route, because it is by definition different. And one of the other things that you could be open to criticism to is genre norms. So there are artistic standards and genre norms that you could definitely break them. And I love rule breakers, but you should understand the genre you're writing in, because there are some norms and rules that are associated with that genre that if you violate them, you're kind of, rowing upstream without a paddle, that type of thing. And so I think that hinges more on that, but definitely understanding genre is really important. And also because of length, so there are standards for, if you're writing a mystery novel and you write a mystery novel at 130,000 words and you've never written a mystery novel before and you're trying to get this thing published, whether you're doing it indie or traditional, there's a good chance that you're not putting yourself in a good position for success, for different reasons, but it's still, you should probably still cut that thing down to what would be industry standard. One, most importantly, I don't even care about the commercial aspect. This is a book about craft, and like the making your something commercially viable is a whole nother conversation. But from a craft standpoint, you probably have a pretty large pacing problem in there. And like, you might not realize it, but putting someone to sleep in the middle of Act 2 is not a good thing. It's like, we want this thing to move.
Right. All right. I cut you off. So we were talking about medium, object, and mode. So
object.
Yeah, let's talk about object.
So object is characters. So what characters are essential to telling this story other than your protagonist? That is, you got to figure out, so if you have your protagonist and they have a love interest, the parents, the this, the that, who else is essential to telling this story? And essential is a key word, because everything from an Aristotelian standpoint relies on how essential is this to tell the story? How essential is this scene? How essential is this character? How essential is this chapter in a novel sense? Being essential is a critical component to an Aristotelian style of storytelling. That third piece is the most important for a novelist, though, at least in my opinion, which is, so I said medium, object, and mode. And mode is the narration. So how are we going to tell this story from a point of view standpoint and a tense standpoint? So are we telling it in first person? Are we telling it in second person? Are we telling it in third person? Are we utilizing one point of view? Are we utilizing 2, 3, 4 points of view? This is really important, because this could get super messy for the novelist if you're not paying attention to this early on. You're always striving to be technically sound. Now, of course, editors exist for this reason, but I think not only is it a good idea for you to be technically sound, but it's the only way for you to actually get better at your craft, to understand what it means to maintain a first person singular point of view or maintain a third person limited point of view. So these are all things that go kind of beyond what this book promises, because it gets a little bit more into the nuanced nature of writing. But it is important to understand that all three of those provide different effects for your audience. So a first person point of view is very intimate, right? Like you're in the mind of Holden Caulfield, which is interesting because if you go back and you read J.D. Salinger's third person story, if you go back and read J.D. Salinger's short stories with Holden Caulfield in them before he wrote The Catcher in the Rye, they were done in third person. So he changed to first person to write The Catcher in the Rye. And we obviously know how that turned out. It was a resounding success.
It was a good idea. But it doesn't always work to do first person. And I've noticed my tendency when I'm writing novel type stuff is to do the first person, maybe because I was so influenced by Catcher in the Rye early in my life. I'm just making this realization right now. But that's maybe the reason, because that was how I was introduced. But some of my favorite books are written in the third person because, for example, Lonesome Dove is one of my favorite books, right? Because every time I don't know if you've read that book, but every time he pulls out in the third person, he's able to sort of narrate it from the perspective of the different characters that he's introducing. Because you can't, if you're coming from one person's perspective, it's harder to get inside the head of other characters because it's all through the perspective of your first person character, right? So I find it very interesting, like to make those decisions and when to know whether to make something a first person or a third person story. Like what would be the benefits and disadvantages of.
So I would say if I'm going from an Aristotelian point of view, it has to be in service of the story itself. So what kind of story are you telling? Are you telling an expansive story? If you're telling an expansive story, we need third person. We can't tell it in first person unless even if you tell it in a multi-point of view first person, you're still only getting this person's narrow point of view in alternating chapters or whatever. The one thing you get from a third person point of view is the expansive nature, but it's also worth it to realize that first person provides limitations and limitations aren't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, especially for creative people. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and third person could be very strangling because of the freedom. And especially if you're doing omniscience, right? Like omniscience is when there's like an all-knowing God.
Yeah.
I think of The Godfather, one of my favorite novels that does this, but a lot of sci-fi, a lot of fantasy leverages this for the world building aspects, but you can get into a lot of trouble when you're trying to head hop from character to character. And it could be very confusing for the reader. Third person limited is when you're doing a third person, but you're doing it almost through a first person lens. So you're writing from the point of view of each character through almost like a first person lens. That to date is my preferred method although I've written in first person quite a bit, but I like the third person lens, but from a limited approach. There's also second person. So a lot of stories, aren't told through second person.
Bright Lights, Big City. That's the first.
Bright Lights, Big City is a great novel. That is.
Yeah.
So here's the overarching thing. Oh, actually, I didn't finish the thought there. So second person is when you do this, you do that. So it really places you into the seat of the protagonist or the reader, right? So you are the protagonist in a sense. But the overarching thing with all of this and how this is bundled up in an Aristotelian sense is through one word: consistency. Whatever you decide that your novel is going to, leverage, what point of view, stylistically, what structure, what characters, it needs to be consistent. Not consistent from page 1 to page 300, but if you're going back and forth, changing points of view, say we do chapter 1 with first person, chapter 2 with third person, we need to be very consistent with third person in the second chapter and very consistent with, so the consistency has to do with a great novel that I read was called Trust by Hernan Diaz. And he tells that novel in 5 parts. It won the Pulitzer 2 years ago. And he writes that novel in 5 parts, and each part is radically different from a style standpoint. But the one thing that is the same is that he's consistent with that radical style in each part. So it's not consistently the same throughout, but it's consistent in that part. And that's a really important thing for me to kind of highlight, because no matter what you decide to do and how you tell your story, even for the most unorthodox writer, the thing that is the same is that they are consistently unorthodox.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I mean, there's so much we could talk about. I almost feel like this gives people sort of a teaser into your book, because there's so much to dig into. I mean, we've like probably touched on 10% of what your book digs into. I want to talk a little bit about another part of your life, your career, and that's your Books for Men podcast. Tell me why you decided to do that podcast. Why you felt that was important. Yeah.
That's a great question. And it is important. And I think that is the word that I would like to describe the reason why I did this. And that is, this podcast is a labor of love. I'm a huge reader. We joked about how I came to it late, but
but now you're making up for it, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, 10 times more than anybody.
Since a slow start at childhood. But the reason why I started Books for Men is because I can look at the data and I can reference some of the data, but I would challenge anybody next time they're around a group of guys to ask them, what are you reading? And I do this, and I'm always shocked, although I shouldn't be at this point because it's so regular, that most of the time they're not reading anything. And if they are reading something, the majority, and when I say majority, I mean like 1 out of 10 people who actually are reading, the majority of those people are usually reading nonfiction. Fiction is kind of fallen by the wayside, and it's sort of an open secret in the publishing industry that men don't read. It's not something that is widely talked about, but if you talk to people inside of the industry, or if you write something, I know from experience, sadly, that is male centric, they'll say, oh, this sounds great, but who's going to buy this book?
Well, if you the books that I get pitched, for my podcast, it's almost always for women, books almost always for women, the fiction, the novels.
Well,
they're female characters or female. Yeah.
But this is, so there's some nature and some nurture with this. I don't want to let guys off the hook totally in that they're just not reading. I think we've gotten to a place in the industry where the data would show that it is an overwhelmingly female industry, both in publicists, editors, writers, in a fiction sense. And by the way, this is a very unique thing in the creative industry. The only industry that's like this. It's not like this in film. It's not like this in music, but it's like this in the fiction world. And so I think there's this self-compounding thing that would just make sense why there's potentially more books that are coming out that are, female-centric main characters, female topics. I mean, I understand that there was a correction that was necessary, but if we look at the data for what it actually is, I think it's somewhere around 75 to 80% of the entire industry is female in the fiction world, and only 1 out of every 5 novels is purchased by a man. And I'm not beating my chest for male rights here. I'm just literally speaking of the reality of the industry.
Yeah, and it's kind of a chicken and egg. Like, is it because there was a correction made and it alienated men, or is it because men just weren't interested in reading fiction for whatever reason? I don't know.
Well, this is the real question. This is the question. And I think that there are definitely some advantages to reading nonfiction, or perceived advantages. All of the value, and I use that word value because men, at least men that I know, tend to be more transactional. And so the value in reading a fiction novel is unseen, right? I'm going to be more empathetic for somebody. I'm going to be more patient. I'm going to delay gratification and learn how to delay gratification. I'm going to learn how to engage with difficult thoughts and opinions. And it's going to be easier for me to do so because of reading. Like, these are all value, extremely valuable things. But I could tell them, like, the soft skills versus hard skills. It's a hard sell, because when you're trying to sell a nonfiction book, like Aristotle for Novelists, let's say, it promises something specific. It promises that if you read this, you're going to understand story better. That's much easier than saying, read my novel because you're going to be more empathetic. It's a value proposition thing. And now with the onset of audio, and, I even when I talk to men who tell me they're reading, a lot of them, I find out that it's audiobooks. It's not that they're reading the actual book.
Even me, I confess that I do that a lot.
Look, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, this is what's happening, right? Yeah. Like, and so if we're looking at it honestly, with any kind of, transparency and just not being swayed by external pressure, or just looking at it, like, honestly, it became clear to me that men don't read. And so the whole point of books for men is really just, I'm a man who reads quite a bit, who reads a wide spectrum, both fiction and nonfiction. And so you could check out the podcast, and if I like that book, maybe you're a man who would like this book too. And that's the whole thing. It doesn't single out women in any regard. And by the way, I have a lot of female listeners who reach out to me and they say, why is it called Books for Men? Because this has nothing to do with men. And I said, because I want to draw attention to the fact that I want to inspire more men to read.
Yeah. It's not exclusive. You're not doing it because you are denigrating what women are contributing.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Not even
if
close.
anything, I mean, maybe some of the books have been written by women, right? I mean,
a lot. Joan Didion. I feature female authors on there, not as frequently as male authors, because the data would suggest, and I am part of that data because I am a man, that men are more prone to reading other men.
Right. I get that. Well, we're different. Men and women are different.
Yeah.
Tell me, okay, so in closing here, tell me, if you're a guy listening to this and you're maybe haven't picked up a novel in a while, or you just don't get turned on by novels, what would be like 3 books that you would just say? I mean, you already mentioned a few in this podcast, but what would be 3 books to get guys excited about reading that you think, I know your whole podcast is about this, but is there 3 that come to mind?
I would say the best book that's a guy that any man could read, I already referenced in this show. It's not a comedy, it's a tragedy. It's The Road by Cormac McCarthy.
Mm-hmm.
I've never recommended that book to somebody, had them pick it up, read it, and not enjoy it.
Yeah, The Road's great.
It's a very male-centric novel between a father and a son, written in a very simplistic style, which is much different than other Cormac McCarthy books. But there's a reason why it resonated with so many millions of people. And so I would suggest The Road. But if you want to really read a novel, it's perhaps one of my favorite novels. And every time I suggest it, no one's really heard of it.
Really?
If you want to go down the literary lens, there's a novel called Miles from Nowhere by Naomi Munn. Talk about something that will put you way outside of your point of view. This is written from the point of view of a 13-year-old homeless Korean girl trying to navigate the streets of 1980s New York City.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay.
It's one of my favorite novels. It's one of the best novels that I've ever read. And she's never written another novel. This is the only novel she's ever written.
It's like her great work. Yeah. Sometimes people only have one novel in them. But anyway, if it's a great one.
I love it. So okay. I would say exciting. The Road.
Never heard of it. Miles from Nowhere.
The Road, Miles from Nowhere. And then my third, now this is a bit dated, but he's one of my favorite authors of all time. And that's Richard Price, who's written, a lot of big epic crime novels.
Didn't he write on The Wire? Yeah.
Yeah, he was part of The Wire. Yeah. He's a phenomenal writer. Yeah. All that
New York crime.
Yeah. Oh, crime. Yeah. But Lush Life is a phenomenal novel.
Oh, Lush
It's a
Life.
Lower East-
Okay.
Yeah, it's a Lower East Side, New York City novel. It's probably his best in my opinion. But he just had a brand new book come out, which I'm so excited about. He hasn't published a book in like, I don't know, over 10 years or something like that. And so it literally just came out this past week, and so it was fresh in my mind. But he, if you go back to his early stuff, because his work spans from the 70s up until present day. He's been writing novels and but he was a writer on The Wire. He wrote The Night Of, which is that
incredible.
Another incredible. He
It's on HBO.
Yep. He helped. I believe he was helped with on The Deuce as well with George Pelecanos. David Simon obviously was on that show. I'm trying to think of what else. Richard Price was involved with The Wire, as you already mentioned.
He just has. He's great with. I don't know. Was he a cop? He knows how to write in the voice of a New York kind of gangster cop. Yeah,
there's that, and he also like David Simon or George Pelecanos or any of those style of writers. They really focus on realism, which is a different thing than saying, I want to tell you the most entertaining story I could tell you.
Right.
It's a focus on telling it how they think it would actually happen, not how it's most attractive to get the most eyeballs. It's really an emphasis on believability, which is another concept from Aristotle for novelists, not to go back to that book, but it's realism at the most hyper extreme that you could possibly create. David Simon did this extremely well with The Wire and those shows that we had just mentioned, but Richard Price does this as well. And a lot of times, as we all know, realism and reality and truth isn't really flattering. And so it takes a lot of courage and a lot of gusto to write like that. And I think that's, for me,
those
what
are great.
resonates.
Those are actually, well, I read The Road, but they're two. I have not read Lush Life, so I'm excited now to read these books. And I definitely have not definitely.
But I need to ask you, what's your favorite? I need to come away with this for the recommendation.
Well, I was going to add to your list. So you mentioned Ken Follett. I always tell people to read Pillars of the Earth because I just think it's just a great historical novel that has real characters and really, really bad guys and really good guys. And I just couldn't put it down. It was a book that got me excited about reading. So I love Pillars of the Earth. I'm a little bit more traditional. Like, I don't read as much literary fiction anymore. I do love like good stories. I read Pachinko recently, and I just love Pachinko, which is, it's taking you into a time that I had never even thought of, which is basically like Korea in the early 20th century, right before the Japanese invade, and then the Japanese invade during the war, and then this woman and her family moved to Japan, and then it's Japan in the 80s. I mean, it's so interesting, the whole world. And I lived in Japan, so I have a little bit of an affinity to books that are set in Japan because I love Japan. But just, I didn't even know the Pachinko parlors were owned by the Korean mafia in Japan. I had no idea until I read Pachinko. And then my third book would be, now I got to look at my shelf. Well, I mentioned Lonesome Dove. I just think, for a guy, and women could enjoy this book too, but Lonesome Dove is just, have you read Lonesome Dove?
I haven't. And I'm kind of ashamed that I haven't, because you've referenced it twice now.
I mean, that book, it just blew my freaking mind. I don't know. I just thought Larry McMurtry, it's a Western, but it's like, I think he said basically, I want to write a Western about what cowboys were really like. Cause he grew up in Texas and knew real cowboys, or knew people who knew, cowboys were around a long time ago, the real cowboys. But it has great characters, great story. It is a absolute page turner. And it does everything right. I can't imagine a better, just a book with that's more like perfect. And then, he never quite replicated. He wrote a lot of versions of that book, and a lot of those characters come and go, but that one is the definitive one. And yeah, so I tend to like his.
I will read Lonesome Dove, 100%.
Yeah, I tend to like historical fiction. Lonesome Dove was one of those books where it's the first 30 pages, kind of like The Wire, where the first episode I was like, what is this? And then it hooked me. And then the Lonesome Dove is the same way. Like kind of like the first 30 pages, you're like, what is this? I'm not sure. I'm like liking this. And then all of a sudden you're hooked and you can't get out. And you're like, I can't. I remember I took it with me on a trip to Mexico, a family trip. And my family was like, I was like, let's do some downtime now, because I just wanted to always run back to my room and read the book, because I didn't care about anything we were doing on our trip. I just wanted to read the damn book. I was so excited. I couldn't take it. Anyway, love that book. But anyway, I got it.
Can I give you 3 recommendations based off of what you just said?
Yeah.
Quick. You lived in Japan. My favorite translated Japanese author is Fuminori Nakamura.
Okay.
The Thief by Fuminori Nakamura is a great crime novel.
Oh, wow.
Great entry point to Fuminori Nakamura. He literally is one of my favorites.
I don't think I know Nakamura's work, so I'll check it out.
The other is 5 Decembers by James Kestrel. Okay. It's a historical fiction novel about, I won't even tell you what it's about. That, and then the other would be The Sun by Philip Meyer.
I have on my shelf, and I have not.
That's another great.
That's a Western.
You're talking about Westerns.
Yeah, that's a Western.
Those are 3. Just to parlay off of what you were,
all right,
some of your interests there.
Well, Douglas Vigliotti, this has been like just a wealth of information. I'm just so glad that we found each other, and I love learning from you. I could take a course on Aristotle for novelists from you. You should teach it as a course. Are you on TikTok?
I am not on TikTok. Only Instagram.
Have you ever watched? So I've started watching TikTok recently, and they
I'm afraid.
They have these guys that come on. They're basically, lesser used, right? They come on and they have I'll send you a link, but they have these stacked. They'll have like a stack of books, and they'll be like, here are 3 books you just have to read tomorrow. They get hundreds of thousands of views. It's just all they're doing is recommending books to read. And I have actually gotten some good recommendations from that. I guess they call it book talk. And they're not like the TikTok videos that you would think that your kids are watching. It's like, it's like for us basically. So I just think you would be such a natural, because you already have this expertise. You know so much about books, to just pick up, here are 5 historical fiction books you have to read tomorrow, or here you would just, I don't know. And then we'd drive a tremendous amount of traffic to your, podcast. So anyway, I recommend it. Look into it. I'll send you a link.
Send me the link.
Yeah.
I thought about creating a course around this material. So you are like
You should definitely do it, man. I'm all into teaching. All right. Well, Douglas, thank you so much for joining us. And if people want to find out more about you, is there a website they can go to?
Yeah, really easy. Either my name, douglasvigliotti.com, or if they want to find more out about Aristotle for Novelists, they can go to aristotlefornovelists.com.
Awesome.
What do you mean?
Thank you for listening to Right About Now, hosted by my dad, Jonathan Small. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to his podcast on iTunes or wherever you may find podcasts. Or you can go to his website, rightaboutnowmedia.com, and listen there. This is Ella, reminding you to do the right thing. Thing.
Thanks, Ella.
You're welcome.
Perfect.